Battlefront 2 is exceedingly popular right now, with millions claiming it during the various free periods for all the different platforms. At this point, a Battlefront 3 seems inevitable, or at least like a no-brainer. And I have a few ideas for it, a wish list if you will. So here are some of my ideas. First thing on my list, weapons. The way weapons work in Battlefront 2 is messy. Each class has 5 weapons, with 4 of them being a cross-era variation on the main style of gun for that class. What this basically means is the origins of all 4 are from all over the Star Wars universe and timeline. However, the base, unlocked from the start weapon, is different. It is the only blaster that cannot be modded and has its model changed depending on which faction you are playing. Basically, Imperial Stormtroopers as assaults get their iconic E11s, Rebel officers get the famous DH-17, and so on. This means that despite different factions technically using different models when selecting or defaulting with the base gun, they will all be running with the same stats. As you can imagine, the unlockable guns are better than their base counterparts and can be modded even further to improve them even more so. This leads to most players sticking with their favorite blaster, modding how they like it, and so most games feature cross-era guns across all modes. This means the changing base gun feature ended up more a gimmick than anything else. So with Battlefront 3, assuming it has multiple eras, which is probably a pretty safe assumption, can go 2 ways to improve upon this aspect of its weapon selection. Either it can expand the rotating model but same stats mechanic to all guns across the class, allowing all selectable guns to change appearance depending on faction, or they can ditch this entirely and allow for cross-era guns with their unique stats and designs to be chosen by any faction. My choice between expanding the faction blaster rotation or free-for-all choice would be the free-for-all option. Not only does this unlock all the previous models that were previously used unlocked to a specific faction and immediately expand the roster, but it also allows for more robust experience, as seemingly those weapons would be available for mod upgrades as well. More choice in this regard is much better and can be a key aspect in providing variety across the game, as it is one of the core and fundamental aspects. I am more for opening up mechanics in a Battlefront game, allowing for an environment of a sandbox as contrasted to a more theme-focused experience. Speaking of, some star cards are themselves weapons, or represent buffs or changes to weapons that are locked behind abilities of different classes. Locked behind ability weapons include the Scattergun as Vanguard, the EE4 as Infiltration, and the Minigun as Sentry. Meanwhile, weapons like the Stinger and Flash Pistol are equipable by star cards and replace base abilities. For Battlefront 3, I would like to see more traditional weapons like the EE4 and Stinger Pistol make their way to the regular selectable weapon system, much like how the Cycler Rifle and the Pulse Cannon did in some capacity when they moved from 2015's Battlefront to 2017's version. However, it does make sense to keep some weapons to equipable abilities, much like how the Scattergun stayed a star card through both Battlefront games. Maybe there could be a third category that could be introduced, the side-off, where weapons like the Flash Pistol or the Stinger Pistol could be a permanent secondary options without the need to attach it to an ability, meant more to achieve a specific effort than to outright damage. Some of the weapons in Battlefront 2 are exclusive to certain classes and characters, but it is not consistent. Some heroes possess blasters only accessible to them, while others simply just have improved variations of what is selectable for the various troopers. This is somewhat unlike 2015's Battlefront, in which all blaster heroes and bodyguards possess blasters that were just improved versions of what could be selected for troopers. In terms of hero blasters and the next game, I would prefer if troopers could access hero blasters as well as give the heroes themselves improved versions. I wouldn't even mind if the blasters played differently on heroes than troopers. For example, the Rel BB-10 could play exactly how it did in 2015's Battlefront for the troopers, but in Bosk's hand, sorry, that's a hard word to say, but in Bosk's hands, it could act as it does now in Battlefront 2. Now, reinforcement weapons vary in terms of exclusivity. Some are exclusive to that reinforcement, some are modded version of trooper available weapons, and some are the stock version. Their weapons also vary in terms of uniqueness, as can be seen with various weapons like the bowcasters, flamethrowers, Ewok bows, and modifiable unique weapons like that of the First Order Jet Trooper and Clone Commandos. I would like it if all reinforcement weapons could be used by troopers, but with some caveats. Essentially, I would transfer the reinforcement weapons into 3 different categories. Weaker, straight up selectable weapons, limited use time star card weapons, and limited use time weapons available for pickup across the map. For example, the commander droids already have an improved version of the S5, bowcasters were already a star card in 2015, and providing a temporary flamethrower in the middle of the map for teams to scrap over, I think would be a great mechanic to implement. With regards to pickup weapons, I believe it could fit a more open approach with regards to map and mode design. Spicing up certain areas of the map with a glorious weapon that could only be used for a limited time, of course, could lead to some interesting gameplay moments and present more freedom of choice, such as that could be achieved by having open vehicles that are accessible to entry and exit at any time.
Well, the grappling hook could be a utility weapon, a weapon that you have to find and pick up on the map. In Halo, you can only carry 2 weapons at a time, so whenever you came across a grappling hook on the battlefield, you'd have to make a choice. Do I keep my 2 damage-dealing weapons, or do I sacrifice the weaker of those weapons for a weapon that does no damage, but greatly increases my mobility on the battlefield? And there you go, you've got a trade-off now. Now you're thinking in arena shooter terms. And if you're killed, guess what? The player that killed you can now steal your grappling hook. That player now has access to your enhanced mobility, and you've just lost it. And because it's just a tool and not intrinsic to the player, it doesn't have a drastic effect on every facet of the game because it's entirely situational. And you can get so creative with it too.
Lastly, not all weapons from previous games that make sense for a modern Battlefront game were included in any capacity in Battlefront 2. Bringing them over, especially all of Battlefront 2015 selectable blasters, would be recommended by myself for a third entry. Star Wars is home to a large variety of weapons that would work in a large multiplayer FPS, especially across the 3 different categories of selectable, star cards, and pickups. And as long as the developers have an attitude of abundance in service of player choice, the more weapons the better in my opinion, as long as they meet the criteria of servicing the player and the core mechanics at the same time. With the different categories weapons could fall into, it is possible to add much more weapons, and that would certainly be on my wish list, with a focus on making sure they fall into a category that would be, well, fall into a correct category that would be the most fun for the player base. So, this is my wish list for weapons in Battlefront 3. It essentially can be described as more weapons, more variations on weapons, and more ways to interact with weapons. Weapons belong to such a core mechanic of any FPS game that they need to be handled with such care as to balance the need for variation requested by players and the ability to balance the meta, which becomes exponentially more difficult the more weapons you have. It can be a daunting task, but if it is done well, it can really make the difference between a great game and a legendary game.
Wait for my command.